What you are seeing right now is what you will be able to create just by watching this short series of videos. It may seem simplistic and kind of arcadey, but nearly every element of this project is essential to learning how to make games in the Unreal Engine. So to get things started, of course we can't start making a game until we actually have an engine to work in, and for us that's going to be the Unreal Engine. So to get that, let's navigate to epicgames.com, and this is immediately going to redirect us to the Epic Games store page, at least for right now. This may be different by the time you're seeing it, but we're going to navigate over here to Unreal Engine. You can click one of two things. You can sign in or you can download. Either way, we're going to have to sign in a minute, so if you don't already have an account, make sure you create one right now. When you go to the download page, it'll bring up some licensing options for you. So you can get, obviously, a publishing license or a creator's license. Both are free. The difference is in the royalties when your product succeeds. And the fact that if you're making it for game development, you will not be able to use the creator's license. If you're making a game, you are going to have to give up 5% royalty when your product succeeds. But don't worry, this 5% royalty only occurs after you've successfully made $1 million in gross revenue. For starters, this is definitely the place to go. Now that that's done downloading, you can probably follow this tutorial here, and they're going to do my job for me. We can just go ahead and skip through the installer here. Alright, now that it's finally installed, which took a little bit longer than expected, you have access to the entirety of the Epic Games launcher, so the home, the store, the library for all your games and everything that you may have, but also the Unreal Engine tab, which has two places that you can go now, the Unreal Engine 4 and Unreal Engine 5, which we'll be covering Unreal Engine 4 in this, because Unreal Engine 5 is still in early access. But if that's something you'd like me to cover in the future, please let me know in the comments, and when Unreal Engine 5 officially releases, I'll try to cover that. Let's head over to our library here, and you won't have any projects. I have quite a few here, but you also won't have anything in your vault, and this will only happen if you signed in. If you're not signed in, it'll prompt you to sign in or sign up if you don't have an account yet. You also won't have any engine versions, and that's what we're going to start by doing. Go ahead and press this little button here, and it'll bring up a list of a bunch of different options for you. Now, unlike Unity, Unreal Engine allows access to almost every single engine version since pretty much the very beginning of Unreal Engine 4. Now, I would highly recommend trying to go with the most recent release, which in my case would be 4.26.2, but for you, that may just be Unreal Engine 5 at this point. For me, I like to use 4.24, but we're going to be using 4.26.2 today. So go ahead and launch the engine once that's installed, which it might take a while, and if it does, feel free to come back to this video when it's done. Now, it will show you all of your recent projects within this engine version. At least for this version, your launcher may look a lot different depending on which version you're using. For us, we're going to select Games, Next, and this should be pretty similar on all launchers. We're going to create a blank project. We could be using a template, but I'm going to go with blank for several different reasons, and mostly because I want to teach all of the fundamentals and not just start from a template. Next, we're going to set up a few options here. Now, this is not everything for our game, and these things can be changed later for the most part, but we want to select a few default settings here. First of all, we're using Blueprint. Maximum quality just to make things look better because scalable 3D or 2D may run better, but it's not really necessary because the scale of game we're creating is kind of small. Ray tracing, I'm going to leave disabled. If you have a graphics card that can handle ray tracing and you know that it can, maybe you can enable this and mess around with the settings if you'd like to. We're going to keep it disabled because that's very far out of our reach for the game that we're trying to create. Next, we're going to be creating this for desktop and console because mobile and tablet is another thing for another day. Next, we're going to turn starter content off because we really don't need any of it, and we can add it later if we wanted to. One of the last things we're going to do here is we're going to find a location to place this project that we're creating. Go ahead and hit these three dots here, and you can find a spot on your computer that you want to save it to. With larger scale games where we're creating a lot of assets in our content browser and our folders are starting to add up and there's folders within folders and files with really long names, Unreal Engine can only compute a certain amount of characters in this length here, and I believe that number is 260, 266. It's not really necessary right now, but it is something to consider that you want to keep this file length as short as you can. I'm gonna name this Cubathon. One of the first things you might notice that may be different based on your engine version is the look of the editor, especially if you're trying to follow along in Unreal Engine 5. This is the look of Unreal Engine 4 right now. There are a few darker skins here going on. In earlier versions, this looks a little bit lighter, but also in Unreal Engine 5, the content browser, I believe, doesn't show up by default and kind of hovers on top of things when it does. So a few things will be slightly different, but it's generally the same idea, and we're going to learn what these things are. First thing we want to focus on here is the viewport here. That's the main area that we can look around our scene, move around, and edit things. If you right-click in the scene and move the mouse around, you can look around the scene, and if then you press the WASD keys, you can move around the scene. You can also use keys like E to go up, Q to go down, C to zoom in on the field of view, and Z to zoom out, but those are pretty unnecessary most of the time. You can also left-click and move the mouse to kind of pan around the scene on only the X and Y axis. Which brings me to my first point. Unreal Engine is a Z-up engine, while Unity is a Y-up engine. And all this means is that the Z axis is up, while X and Y are left and right. Well, in Unity, X and Z are left and right, and Y is up. That doesn't mean a whole lot, and it doesn't create a whole lot of changes or anything, but when you're switching engines, which a lot of you may be doing, it can be a little confusing at times. But Z will always be up in Unreal Engine. You can also use the middle mouse button to pan around based on where your screen is facing. You can also hold Alt and left click to pivot around the center point of our view, which we can even go upside down, which is kind of disorienting. You can also select an object in the scene, like this floor for example, and then press Ctrl Shift and the right mouse button to move along the Y-axis and the left mouse button to move along the X-axis, and then press both for Z. Most of these we'll most likely never use, but it's still good to know that they exist. Also, if you ever want to move this around, you can click this little yellow corner here, and it'll bring down the viewport, and then you can click and drag and adjust this however you'd like. On the right here, we have our world outliner. This is comparable to the Unity's hierarchy. In fact, it's pretty much the same thing. It contains our level, or levels if you have multiple, and everything within that level. And you notice when I click on an object, whatever that may be, whether this atmospheric fog here, the floor, the sky sphere, it is selecting it in the scene. Also, this sky sphere is so big, but the center point is right here at the same point as the floor, so it looks like we're not actually moving it. But if I select the sky sphere, you can see it's its own separate object. And when I select an object, you'll see over here in the details panel, a lot of details are selected. So if I select nothing, it all goes away. But the moment I click on something, there are details specific to this object in the world. If you're coming from Unity, you most likely know these collapsible little things here as components. And yes, they technically are, but in Unreal, we're going to learn these are components. These are more so considered components, and these are more so considered details connected to these components, because we can edit multiple components with several different details here. Next, we have the content browser, which is just like the project panel in Unity, where you can drag and drop assets and everything that you want in your game. You can import things and you can move them into your scene. This is where your levels will be stored. This is where all blueprints will be stored. This is basically where all of your game content will lie. And finally, on the left here, we have a little bit of an easy access menu. So instead of, like in Unity, right-clicking and creating objects, or coming over here to the world outliner and creating objects, you actually have a little panel here to do that for you. And this can be handy. I kind of generally would place this here, or bring the world outliner to the left and then place this next to it if you wanted to get really close to the way Unity looks. This is pretty similar. This isn't the layout I'm going to be using, but this is a layout you could use if you're more familiar with it. But always remember, if you want to adjust things and then you realize, I don't really like how this looks, you can come up here to Window, you can load a layout that you've saved if you'd like to save layouts, but you can also remove layouts or just load the default editor layout. And any window that you don't have open when you restart the editor, or just in general, you can come up to Window and find it over here. For example, the world settings. I'm actually going to open this up, and I like to dock it over here next to the details panel. I'm not sure if that's where it comes up by default. It might just show up here, but if so, just grab it and drop it wherever you like. I'm going to put it over here by the details panel. So the first thing we're going to do, because I messed around in this scene a little bit, we're actually going to come over here to File, New Level. We're going to create the default level. It's just going to recreate this scene. We don't have to save anything that we did here. We're just going to start over with a fresh scene here. And what what I'm actually going to do to start is I'm going to adjust this level to make it look as close to the Unity startup as possible. Because if you'll notice, we have a lot of extra things here. In Unity, it starts you with a main camera and a directional light. In Unreal, we start with a lot of other things here on the side that we don't really need right now. So I'm actually going to remove the sky sphere, the sphere reflection capture, and the floor. We can also get rid of the player start. So now we have three things. We have the atmospheric fog, the light source, and the skylight. And the reason I'm leaving the atmospheric fog is because if I disable that, you can see the whole scene just goes dark. And I want to keep some lighting in here, at least a little bit. Plus, it looks a little bit more like the Unity skybox. We're also just going to come over here to place actors and look for camera. We're going to drag a camera in here. We can give this a name over here in the hierarchy. You can double click it, it'll focus on it. You can right click, edit, rename, or you can simply press F2. We're going to rename this to main camera. Also, as a side note here, you can click on objects and press F on the keyboard to focus on them, or you can do what I did there where I double clicked in the hierarchy. Now we're going to bring in a floor. I know we just deleted it, but we're going to bring in a new one. Come over here to place actors and drag in a cube. And you can see it's going to just sit in our world wherever we place it. We can use the movement controls in Unreal to look at where it is in the scene, but it might be a little bit hard to decipher where exactly it sits. And this is where the details panel comes in. You can click on our cube or we can select it in the hierarchy. You'll hear me refer to the world outliner as a hierarchy a lot just because it's pretty much the same thing. We're going to come over here, we're going to open this transform drop down here. This is basically a detail that contains a lot of information about where in the scene this is, how it looks, and how we can interact with it. The transform itself contains location, rotation, scale, and mobility. The location gives an exact numeric value of where this sits in the scene on the X, Y, and Z axis. So as you can see, it's positioned negative 520 units on the X, 740 on the Y, and 410 on the Z. Now this is all relative to the center or origin point of the scene, which is 0, 0, 0. So if we reset that there, it'll bring it all the way back to 0. And that brings us to rotation, which is the same thing, and we have a few tools up here to our advantage. We start out on the select and translate tool, where we can translate objects' position in the scene, which basically is just another word for move them around. And this is a transform gizmo, which is a complicated name for something that's very simple to understand. It's literally just arrows on 3 different axes. We also have these little boxes here. You'll understand how they work if you just click on them and move them. So you can see the little box between the X and Y axis. You hover over them, looks like they both get selected, and if you move them, you can move them along both axes at once. Same thing with any of these little boxes, and then all of them together if you hold the little sphere in the corner. If you want to reset this position, you can hit the little reset to default arrow if it does show up. Sometimes it does. I've found that sometimes it doesn't, but either way, resets it to 0, 0, 0. Then there's the scale. The scale of the object is set to 1 by 1 by 1, and you can lock this so that if you change one value, all of them change, or unlock to where you can scale this to like 10 and it'll stretch. And then we have rotation, which if you come over here and you select the select and rotate objects button, we can rotate on different axes, and you'll see it's snapping to a grid. That's something we'll get into later, but you can adjust snapping options if you would like to. So if I wanted to snap 50 units instead of 10 like before, you'll see it's much snappier on this grid, and the grid does update in real time. Once again, rotation 0, 0, 0 to return it to its original placement, or you can click the little arrow just like I did for location there. And then the scale here, we can scale these objects up in any way we would like. And now one thing you've probably noticed immediately is that Unreal Engine doesn't have a game view like Unity does. The only way to see how things are working in our game would be to play it. Well, there's also another option here. If you click this little drop down that says change play mode and play settings, you can click the simulate option and it will simulate what's going on in the scene from the current camera's view. And if we had moving objects and characters and things, we would see them interacting with each other in the game in the simulation mode. And this is where we can click on things, and this is the only place where we can actually influence how things are interacting in the scene in real time. Just remember, if I were to like set this to 500 or 5,000 like I did on accident there, and then you stop, it returns it exactly back to where it was beforehand. And you saw I got a bunch of errors there. Basically, this was just telling me that the object that I had selected that I was trying to move in real time was not set to movable. If I do have this set to movable and I simulate though, now you can see it's actually updating in real time. Whereas before, if I set it to static and then I tried to move it, it has a little bit more of a hard time. We're going to scale up our cube here to make it fill up the scene a little bit more. So we're going to give this something like 100 on the X to make it a little bit longer, and 15 on the Y, and we're going to leave the Z at 1. Because once again, this is a Z up engine, so if we move the Z at all, you can see it's scaling upwards, and we don't want that. We want to leave that at 1. Now I placed my camera a little bit high here. I did do a little bit of adjustment. We'll set the camera at something like 200 for now, and I just have it set to negative 1000 on the X just to make it back a little bit further. This might be a little bit too far. We can do something better like negative 500. We can always take a look at the camera here, which is an actual object in the scene, but we'll never see it in game. But you can zoom out here, just scroll out a ways, and you'll see that this ground plane is actually pretty big. We can select this in either the scene view itself or over here in the world outliner, and we're just going to give this a new name. And you can always hit F2 or right click it, edit, rename. We're going to name this ground. And we're going to grab the X-axis here, and we're going to drag it over to where it looks like it sits about where the camera is. We're going to bring in another cube now actually, and this is going to be our player. So we're going to bring this in, and you'll see it'll kind of clip through the ground here. We can bring it up here, and you'll see we can set a little bit above the ground, or we can get as close to the ground as possible. With this 10 snapping, because we're not snapping, if I were doing this, it would be much harder to determine where the ground actually is. We can get pretty close, but what you can always do is bring it up as high as you'd like, and then hit end on the keyboard, and it will snap to the closest piece of ground that it can find below it. We're also going to make sure that it's at 0 on the X and 0 on the Y. You'll see the Z values close to 100, but it's actually 100.250092, and that value I believe continues for a while. So we're just going to make sure that this is set to exactly 100 just to keep things consistent and clean. Obviously, nothing really changed here, but it just makes it look cleaner when we click on it. So we can see 0, 0, 100. Once again, we're going to rename this cube to player. Right now, it's a bit hard to tell what is the player and what is the ground, or if this is even a player because it's all one color. So to do this, we're going to create a material. Come down to your content browser here, and this is the first time we're not going to be just placing an actor. Also, you'll notice they're called actors, not objects, and that I'll get into at a later point. We're going to come down here to our content browser, right click, and select material. I like to be consistent with my naming conventions, so I will do M_player. And the M is for material, just like we'll be using BP_ for blueprints and things like that. I'll explain them as I go. For the most part, I like to put the naming convention of what the content is before the name of that piece of content. We're going to open up this player here, and you can see if we click on it, unlike in Unity, it's not going to give us any details, and that's because the Unreal Material Editor is an entire different system of blueprints. So if we double click that, it'll bring up this, and oh boy, is there a lot going on here. You can see there's an entire material preview over here on the left. We have a bunch of details here on the left as well, along with parameter values. Then we have this entire graph here in the center, and all of these different things here on the right. It gets kind of complicated here, because as you can see, there are a lot of different things we can use, and if we just click and drag on one of these and drop them onto the graph, you can see it creates a node for us. This will be our first introduction to the material editor and blueprints as a whole, but we're not going to go too crazy with this. This is going to be very simple. So we're going to right click, and we're going to just press the 4 key, and you can see constant 4 vector. This is complicated. We're just going to select it. You can also hold 4 on the keyboard and left click. We're not going to go into too much explanation of what this is. Basically, this is a group of 4 values that create a color, and we can click that node here, come over here to the left, and where it says constant, we can click this. It brings up a color picker. This probably looks a lot easier to understand. Basically, we're just going to give it a red value, maybe a little bit of a darker, kind of lighter red. Hit OK, and then we're going to drag this execution pin right here into the base color. We're going to hit apply, and this might take a second because it does take a while to compile materials in Unreal because they can get super complicated, and there's a lot going on to calculate here. And there we go. We can see our material has updated in the little material preview here. We're going to hit save, and we're going to close this completely. We can then take our player material here from the content browser, click and drag it onto the player. And no, this won't update in real time, but we can drop it there, and you can see now our player has a little material. Next, we can just go ahead and grab our camera here, and you can see the little preview down here in the corner. To me, I think this is a little bit far away from our player, so we're just going to grab the little x-axis here and move it along. And I also think it might be a little bit low, so we can drag it up a little bit if we'd like. And there we go. I think that looks a lot nicer. So now if we wanted to switch back to our selected viewport play mode here, you'll see nothing really happens. In fact, I'm I'm a flying player right now. I can play around in the scene, and I'm not looking through that camera lens that I just was a second ago. So to do that, first we have to make this main camera actually the main camera. Click on the camera here. We're going to come over here to the details panel, and we're going to auto activate for player, and that'll be under the auto player activation tab here. And we're going to set this to player 0. And that may be confusing if you've never done any sort of programming or game development before, because 0 is actually the first index, the first valid index of any player that we find. So when we hit play, we are player 0, and this is going to try to choose player 0. Now if we hit play, now we can look through the camera. And one thing you might notice off the bat are these little black bars on the side, and that's from something happening called contain aspect ratio over here in the details for the camera as well. So make sure you got your camera selected, come over here to camera options, contain aspect ratio, and if you don't want those black bars to show up, you can untick that. And just to see what that would look like, you can go into new editor window by clicking this drop down by the play button, and then adjusting this size of this window. You can see as I go up and skinnier, there's black bars at the top. If I go down and thin and long, it's got black bars on the side. Then if we get it just right, the black bars will go away. So if we want to get rid of this, just uncheck contain aspect ratio, and then if we hit play, no matter how this looks, we will always scale to the size of the window and not contain the aspect ratio. Let's switch back to our selected viewport mode here. If we look through our camera, we'll notice we can't do anything. It's just a camera looking at a cube. And that's because we haven't done any programming yet. In fact, we haven't even told this player that it's the player, other than by naming it that. Now there are several ways to create players in the Unreal Engine, but the way we're going to create it today is actually kind of different. Because of the game that we're creating, we want this character to have physics. So if we drag this cube up right now, you can see we hit play, and it just kind of sits there. And that's good for most objects, but we want this to have physics. So we're going to come over here, we're going to find the physics drop-down menu here, and we're going to check simulate physics. We don't have to add anything, we don't have to add any components, we simply check a box, and now if I hit play, it falls to the ground. And we can see this better if I duplicate this, which you can do by holding Alt and then dragging one of these arrows. And you can see it creates a second one. I'm going to hit N to drop it to the ground there, move it off to the side a little bit, maybe move it forward a little bit. Now if our cube hits it, you can see it falls and interacts with it. Your cube will interact with anything in the world that has collision, and by default, these objects do have collision, but we can't really see that. Like in Unity, you could see, like if we drop down this collision menu here, you would be able to see like that it had a box collider or something. Well here, this is just giving us details about the collision and how the collision will interact with the world, but not actually showing us any collision. And there's not really an easy way to see this collision, at least not right now, because it's not a static mesh we have access to. And if we click this little button here on the left, this weird looking little side button, it'll pop this out. And for you, it's going to look like this. There's nothing there other than our content. So where's this cube even coming from? Well, this cube is part of the engine content. So in the bottom right here, view options, the thing I was just messing with, you can click show engine content. And if we do that, all of these other things pop up here. If we come over here to the right and drop down the static mesh option, you can see it's a static mesh cube. One, we can just double click on this and it brings up a whole new editor with a whole new viewport. Here, we can actually come up to the top where it says collision and show simple collision. And now that's where we can see our box collider. You can see this little green box kind of forming around the cube. We can also select complex collision, which will show us the actual triads of the mesh itself. But we just want to see the simple collision because this is the collision that we would have had in Unity if we added a box collider, but it has it by default. The reason I showed you that the engine content is here is because now if we hit the little magnifying glass here next to the static mesh, it will actually bring us to where this exists. Now that that complex explanation of how collision works in Unreal is out of the way, we can get back to creating physics. There are a bunch of settings for your physics object like the mass, linear dampening, angular dampening, gravity, constraints, there's all kinds of things in here that you can mess with. In fact, I would recommend just kind of duplicating these objects a couple of times. Remember, you can hold Alt and left click and just drag these objects around the scene. And maybe experiment a little, bring in a sphere or something and apply the player material to the sphere to just mess with it. Make sure that you enable physics and then maybe adjust the mass of this one to something like 1,000 and then drop this on top of it. So now if we play, all kinds of stuff happens. It's just fun to see. It's fun to mess with. And something you'll see me probably do a lot is this. where it zooms me into full screen. Well, how did I do that? Well, I pressed F11. You can also come over here to the top left of the viewport, click this little drop down here, and go to Immersive View. In the top right here, you can hit F11 again, or you can click this button in the top right that says Restore from Immersive View, or come up here and disable it. Either one of those options works. I just find that F11 is pretty simple. For me, I'm going to get rid of these extra players here, and I'm going to get rid of the sphere, and I'm just going to bring this player back down to the floor by hitting End. Another thing you can do is press Alt P to play in whatever view mode that you've currently selected. And the last thing we're going to do here is we're going to save our scene. And we can either do this by coming up to Save Current, coming down here to Save All, or simply by pressing Control S. And it's going to bring up this little window here to save the level. And we're just going to save this as level_01. And we can save this in our content folder. We don't need to save it anywhere else. It's not very important right now. We're just going to hit Save, and there we go. And the last thing I like to do is come over here to the bottom left, hit Save All, even though it didn't really do anything. But just in case any changes were missed when I saved the level, we just want to hit Save All just in case. And you can do this as many times as you'd like. Hitting Control S, you can see there's a little quick pop up there where it's saving the map. One thing you've probably noticed this entire time, and it's been bugging you as much as it's been bugging me, I'm sure, there's this little error in the top left that says lighting needs to be rebuilt in all red. Very annoying, very scary. Don't worry, there's no problems here. This is simply telling us that the lighting has not been computed for the scene yet. And as you can see, the shadows aren't great and the scene isn't looking super pretty. In fact, if we zoom far enough away, the shadow just completely disappears. Lighting in Unreal is kind of complicated. Basically what happens is there's this little build option here, and we can build lighting only if we so choose, and it's going to change a lot of things. We're not going to do that yet. You can build the lighting if you'd like to get rid of the error, but just know that the moment you move something in your scene or bring another thing in, that error will come back. And I recommend not building until you have to. What we can do here to get rid of this for now is we're going to select the directional light. I'm going to rename this to directional light, and we're going to set this to movable, and that gets rid of it. In fact, it cleans up our shadows a little bit, makes it look a little nicer, and we'll come back to this later to clean it up even more once the game is finished. There we go. That took care of our error there, and we've got a scene set up, and if we hit play, we've got a little cube in our scene. We can move it up if we'd like, and then play again, and it falls to the ground. Pretty cool for starters. One thing I forgot to mention was that the level pops up down here in the content browser, along with this build data. And we're going to leave the build data alone, but you'll notice that if we create a new level, empty level, and we double click on this level 01, it opens up our level again. And to keep things short and concise, that's going to be everything for this video. Hopefully this gives you a good idea of kind of where to start, how things work in the engine, and the fact that Unreal isn't super complicated, it just looks super complicated. So hopefully this gives you a good starting point, a good idea of what to do, and lets you mess around a little bit and just play with things until you get things working. And then in the next video, we'll get started actually programming some things. Maybe not necessarily getting our character to move around the scene too much, but actually getting some things working together to make this scene more than what it is right now.